I'm Mike Costello, and I'm here with Dr. Iris Freelander, and today we'd like to talk to you about health and spirituality. In today's world, there's a lot of discussion about mind-body-spirit connection, and in metaphysical New Thought philosophy, we spend a considerable amount of time talking about the benefits of the whole person concept, that is, dealing with ourselves and those around us as mind, body, and spirit composing one entity or one body. And in today's world, health and spirituality are a very big interest, aren't they, Iris?
Yes, indeed. And I think it's a wonderful thing that we're all connecting ourselves to mind, body, and spirit aspect of being. Because if we just think of our bodies, then we exercise and we eat properly, but we don't take care of the spiritual aspect. And that's too bad, because that's our most important part.
Very important part. And of course, a lot of us over the last few years, especially those who have been involved in spiritual circles, in religious circles, in healthcare circles, have been interested in the connection between mind and body. And even people who aren't necessarily interested in the spiritual aspect have explored the connection of mind and body. And we do know that our minds have so much influence on our physical bodies, and our minds, in many cases, create the illnesses that we suffer.
Yes, and we talk about that a great deal because we, as you always say, we live in our minds and not in our bodies. And that's true, not in the world. We do live in our minds. And our mind has so much more effect than most people realize. And if I could just impress anything on anyone, it would be to watch their thoughts, to think optimistically, and to think of the positive aspect of being, and to not dwell on the negative. And we all have a tendency to do that. But usually when we get sick or when we have problems in our life, we have that tendency to do that. And if we could always remember not to, we'd be far ahead of the game, wouldn't we?
Absolutely. And I think we also need to be aware of our surroundings and aware of what our surroundings are doing to our mental state. Because for many people, their environment, it could be their immediate environment in their household, in their personal life, in their work life, or even their view of the world, that makes them depressed and negative in many ways. And I think if people find that they're individuals who are influenced in a negative way by their surroundings, whether it be personal or whether it be in the world, they need to be sensitive to the fact that maybe they need to reassess how it is they're viewing the world. And when we look at the mental attitude that some people have of the world, a lot of people have very negative views of the world and world events. And so sometimes what we do is suggest that people de-emphasize that aspect of their life. So often in our counseling work, and you and I are both involved in situations where people come to us and they're so affected by what's going on in the world. They're perplexed, they're confused, they're angry, they're depressed, and all of those emotions just build upon each other as they read the newspaper or watch the news. And I'm not suggesting that people not read the newspaper or watch the news, but if someone has that tendency, and if the world and world events are having that influence on an individual, then perhaps it is time to maybe pull back from looking at those things until they're able to reassess the dynamic of their mind and how they're reacting to the circumstances in the world.
Indeed. And one day last week, I was at someone else's home with babysitting, and I read a book that was very negative thinking, and it was a book that had been on the Oprah list as a very wonderful book. So I picked it up and started reading it, and I needed to go home and write an article after I got home about 8 o'clock. Well, after reading that book, I couldn't think about my article, which would be of a positive nature, because the book was such a downer, and it was about twin boys who were identical twins, and one was a schizophrenic, and the other had more problems in his life than you could ever imagine. And it showed all his problems in very great detail. And I thought, how interesting that I think I know a lot about mind, body, and spirit mechanism, but I couldn't write my article because my mind was so involved in all the negative aspect of that person's life, because it's a very realistic book, and it could happen to anyone, the things that happened, but it just seemed so depressing. And that's why I think people, what you just said is so true, that they shouldn't watch TV too much or read the papers in great detail if they're going to, if it's going to affect them like that. But for one thing, we can, if we will, and I should have done the same thing, thought it through. And that this is just a book, and that yes, this can happen to people, but I mean, we can really counsel ourselves and get over it. But if we can't do that, then we need to not to just to avoid some of the negative aspects of life. I know one of my sons told me years ago, you shouldn't watch those very terrible movies because it affects you too much. And he came in to say goodnight to me, and I had the toothpaste in one hand, the toothbrush in the other, and he said, "Good night, Mother." And I said, "Good night," but they both went in different directions, and it really frightened him. But we had just watched a movie that was a terribly sad, depressing movie. And so I know from personal experience how it can affect us. And sometimes we just have to really see where we are in life. And if we're going through a period of time where people around us have negative aspects happening in their life, like deaths in the family and other negative things, then we know we're more susceptible to those things. And that, to know thyself, and thou knowest all.
Absolutely, and that issue of self-evaluation and introspection is one that we talk about a lot. And we all do need to constantly be looking at ourselves and reevaluating ourselves from a mental standpoint, a spiritual standpoint, and a physical standpoint, and identifying those things that are not good for us. And the way that we can find out what's not good for us in most cases is when things don't make us feel good.
That's right.
If things are depressing us, if things are making us feel badly, either mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, physically, then there's something happening. And we need to know and understand that we have control over how it is our minds operate. We have control over our spiritual understanding and the application of our spiritual belief system to our life. And it's an important thing which we always talk about in this program. When we talk about metaphysical New Thought philosophy, we're talking about principles of our faith, but we're not talking, nor are we asking people to change their faith tradition. And so whatever a person's faith tradition may be, or their level of spirituality, in each case, they can apply that to the introspection of their lives and look at how it is their health in all of these aspects is being affected by the way they think and the people and the circumstances to which they subject themselves. In a familial situation or in a home, in personal life, it's a little bit more difficult because, of course, we're surrounded by the people with whom we've made a commitment or we have some obligation. And so it's a little hard to walk away from those. But we can be aware of the fact that a personal situation at home with a spouse or a child or a significant other is impacting the way that we're thinking and or impacting the way that we feel. Because what we're talking about today is going even beyond the mind aspect or the dynamic of mind, although in our faith tradition, mind is a very big part of our spirituality because we teach that we need to and can align our minds and our thought process with what we call divine mind or the presence of God. So if our mind begins to operate as in alignment with the mind of God, then our thought processes are aligned with that divine and universal purpose. And then we're able to think rightly in circumstances and situations and respond rightly. The mind-body connection is an old area that, from the standpoint of understanding, that we've dealt with for a long time, and that is simple stress. We know causes a variety of things, raises blood pressure, causes us compulsions like eating and other abuses that we have. And so there's really this very important connection. And today we're finding a tremendous connection between health and spirituality and the use of prayer and meditation, the studies that have been done that even indicate, as we know, that people who have faith, any faith, doesn't matter what it is, what faith tradition, what church denomination, people of faith and people who practice their faith and people who gather for worship or for other fellowship opportunities with people of their faith tend to be healthier people. And it has to do with community, I think, as much as anything else, but the sense of support and community as we come together. And spiritual organizations create a wonderful opportunity for this to happen.
Yes, and I think we can see that each in our own lives, and those who are listening would know in looking at their own lives that would be true. And as you said, we both do counseling, and when I look back on people who have had physical problems, it's always started in their mind because they've gone through some kind of trauma. And it might just be something that they don't really want to talk about to their family and friends. They don't want to admit that they're being affected as much by that. But if we would just be honest with ourselves, we can see that very often that's the case when we go into any kind of a mind, body, spirit problem, that it's because we're unhappy with some aspect of our lives that we've not yet come to terms with.
And then very often the converse is true, where people are faced with a physical challenge that comes about from that source or from any source, and then their mental attitude changes. And of course, we see that most in life-threatening diseases.
Yeah.
And you and I have done a lot of work with the terminally ill and with the dying, and it's very interesting. And we can see it from a practical application, and then the journals and the scientific community is coming to a more profound understanding of the fact that as people are faced with life-threatening diseases or illnesses or life-altering experiences, that having a spiritual grounding or a spiritual value base. And again, we're not defining that. We're not saying that a Christian or a Catholic or a Buddhist or a Muslim, we're not saying any is better. We're saying simply that spiritual reality in their life has a positive effect upon the outcome of their disease or illness, and also has an impact upon how sick we become.
Yes, and they can see that. And when just someone in the family becomes quite ill, it affects every member of the family. And the more love that family member has for the one who's ill, the more apt they are to lose their balance and not stay on the steady mental attitude. And I can remember years ago, I had when I went back to school to get a certain degree, a young man said to me, "What are you studying in school?" And I said, "Oh, mind, body, and spirit." And he said, "Well, that just about covers everything, doesn't it?" And actually it does. And if we can all remember that we are mind, body, and spirit, and honor each aspect of our own beinghood, I think there'd be less disease in the world, and there'd be less mental anguish in the world, because we each have to take responsibility for our own beinghood.
And that's a tremendously important and is really a cornerstone of New Thought and a cornerstone of metaphysics, and that is that we do have to take personal responsibility. And we take personal responsibility for what has occurred in our lives, but more importantly, we take personal responsibility for what is occurring in us as a result of that. And when we're faced with illness, or when we're faced with an emotional depression, or when we're faced with challenge or difficulty, it's what goes on inside us that connects us with how it is we're responding to this situation. And I'm thinking of cancer patients that we've dealt with over the years and have seen, and how they respond to pain and how they respond to the debilitation of their disease differently when they have certain spiritual practices that they use. And of course, we use prayer and meditation, but we see today a lot of imagery, which is simply a modification of meditation. But even the use of imagery and guided imagery and meditation is a spiritual aspect that's being integrated into the disease or the illness or the health process.
There's so many wonderful stories about how people have been healed and how people have gone on with their lives. And just this past week, I read a story about Annie Sullivan, who was the mentor for the lady who was blind, Helen Keller. And Annie Sullivan was a British lady, a child, and they kept her in a cage. Have you heard that?
No.
I think it's very interesting, and our listeners would like to hear that. They kept her in a cage in a basement in a home in England because she was so wild, and they couldn't contain her. They couldn't do anything with her. And there was a maid who was scrubbing the floors, responsible for keeping the floors clean. I felt so sorry for that young child who was just like a wild thing in a cage. And she made brownies for her, and she asked permission to bring them, and they said, "Oh, that would be wonderful." And so she brought the brownies, and the girl, Annie Sullivan, didn't touch them, but then she had eaten them by the next day. And then she smiled at that lady, and she hadn't smiled at anyone. And she smiled at the cleaning lady. And then, so she brought her brownies from time to time. And then she said thank you to the lady who made them. And so that kept up for a time. As time went on, then that was a turning point in her life, and they all acknowledged that that was a turning point in her life. And then later on, after she had mentored Helen Keller for a long time, Helen Keller was making a public speech, and she said, "I owe my life to Annie Sullivan." And so Annie Sullivan said, "Well, we both owe our lives to that maid who cleaned the floors and brought the brownies to me." So that, I think, is a long way of saying that we never know, when we touch the lives of other people in mind, body, and spirit, how it's going to affect a human life. And the ripple effect then would go out to affect ever so many more.
And that unseen reality that exists between us and between all people, and the ability that we have to touch people's lives,
Yes.
which really is what the spiritual aspect and integration with the healing process is all about. It's about taking scientific realities and spiritual realities and putting them together in a beneficial and positive way.
Yes, it's almost overwhelming, isn't it, to know that we each have that responsibility to the humankind around us with whom we come in contact.
And as we have that responsibility and accept it, we become more peaceful and more health-filled ourselves. We'd like to pause at this point in the program and give you an opportunity to receive some literature so that you can continue to study the ideas and concepts we're sharing with you today.
We would like to give you the opportunity to explore and discover in your own home the new thought teachings that this program is sharing with you by sending you a free copy of one of these booklets. Simply address your request to Confident Living at P.O. Box 7726, Long Beach, California, 90807. Whatever your dream, whatever your vision, you can reach it through confident living.
Before the break, we were talking about Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller and the great change that took place in their lives. And we've seen similar things, not quite so dramatic, in the lives of people that have been faced with insurmountable, seemingly insurmountable challenges and problems. Before we get too far into the program, we're already into the second half, but before time gets away from us completely, we always want to talk about the value of spiritual exercises such as prayer and meditation and what those do to impact upon our health. And I think a process that you and I both practice and teach and espouse is the use of meditation in order to center ourselves and to maintain health. And also the use of meditation in times of need and times of illness as well. And so that is meditation and prayer. And for many people, there's the thought that they're the same, but there is a difference, isn't there?
Yes, there certainly is a big difference. And prayer, they say, is talking to God, and meditation is listening. And we need to do both. And I've seen it happen, and I know you have too, with many people who have been ill, who haven't meditated before that point in their lives. Because in the East, everyone seems to meditate, and in the West, people are more and more gaining the power of meditation, but not nearly as much as in the East. And so I've taught people to the art of meditation who've been almost on their deathbed, who are quite ill. And it's always very rewarding because they never fail to be grateful for that aspect in their lives at the end of their lives. And it's just being quiet enough to listen to God. And the doctors who work with pain know more and more that it's in the mind. And of course, we've seen that in our own work, that when people fight the pain, then they feel it more fully. But if they just flow with their lives and breathe deeply and meditate, and deep breathing would be the first part exercise to do before meditating. And so we've seen it make a big difference. And we've read about it too, because there's a lot being written about meditation today. It seems that wherever we turn, we're reading about it. And isn't that wonderful that this marvelous aspect of being is more and more widely practiced?
Absolutely. And it is important to distinguish between, for those who have only been exposed to Western meditation or traditional Christian meditation, what we're talking about, which is a different dimension of meditation, which is the integration of Eastern meditation into our Western faith traditions. And the integration of Eastern meditation has more to do with, as you said, listening and being centered and being, as founders of our movement have said for years, being in the silence, which was a term that was used to keep people from being afraid of being meditating. But it's simply going into the silence and allowing that which is divine and that which is infilling and inspirational to guide us and direct us. And then, of course, there are methods of using guided imagery and guided meditations. But so often Western meditations are built upon exercises, if you think of Loyola and some of the others, are built upon exercises where there's actually a thought process that initiates the meditation technique, and there's a contemplation or reflection, which is a dimension of meditation. But so often when we're talking about meditation, we're talking about silence and centering, and then we're talking about guided meditation through imagery that allows us to connect the mind, the body, and the spirit, which is a different aspect of meditation.
Yes, but it's we can know that there are many, with the many different aspects, we can use them for different purposes. And of course, in meditation, we can also ask questions, and meditation is listening to God, but part of it is asking questions and then hearing those answers, and which it's a good time to remind that there is the God aspect within each of us. And in meditation, I think we're being silent enough in our own God aspect of being, the higher self, to listen to God, Creator God, the whole. And so it's just getting our conscious mind and even our subconscious mind quieted so that we can hear that divine aspect of being.
And that goes to the very heart of what we spoke about in the first part of the program, which is metaphysical philosophy and New Thought teaches that we align our mind or our thought or our conscious awareness with the consciousness of God. And when we do that, then we become one with that infinite intelligence. We become individuals or individualizations of the divine presence, and we can be guided and directed in the way that we should go.
Yes, and when we quiet our minds, we're talking about mind, body, and spirit aspect of being. When we quiet our minds and when we don't fret over things, then we're more fully able to live from the spiritual aspect of being. And when we keep our bodies healthy and strong, or when we are able to just relax our physical body, if we're not healthy and strong, then we're able to live from that spiritual aspect of being. So they all intertwine and they're all one, as it were. They interpenetrate each the other, but they're equally important.
And it's tremendously important in today's world when we're all dealing with stress and strain and all of the challenges that we have to understand that we do have this ability to center ourselves and to call upon our conscious awareness, into our conscious awareness, peace and tranquility in the midst of the challenges of life. And that certainly has an aspect of maintaining our health or preserving our health, because we know the damage that stress does to our physical bodies.
Yes, and most people don't realize the greatness that lies within them because they negate their own importance and their own greatness. And we have been taught in the West, I think, more than we should have been, that God is out there somewhere and God punishes, or we need to be fearful of God. Or we've been taught an aspect of godhood that's really not healthy for our being. So if we can just know that God is love, pure love, and that aspect is within us, and the more we are able to relax and be at one with divine creator God, then the more we know that we are important, and then we have a certain sense of self-esteem that we wouldn't otherwise have.
Right, and that goes to the very heart of some of our disconnected mind, body, spirit experiences, because for so many of us, and we know in counseling and psychology and sociologists know well, that one of the greatest difficulties that people have is the issue of low self-esteem.
That's right.
And low self-esteem creates a myriad of dynamics in mind and a myriad of picturings in the life of individuals and in the physical bodies and the manifestation of disease. And so it is tremendously important that people become aware of the fact, and the fact that that mind is creating constantly, and that our minds in some cases are really creating detrimental situations in our physical bodies.
Yes, that people have anxiety attacks because of that very thing, and most diseases start in the higher bodies and then sift down into the physical. So we can stop those by just by our very thinking and being positive and optimistic. And a lot of people would say, well, what do I have to be optimistic about? Well, it's like you use the example sometimes in your church services that if you have a checkbook, it's an indicator that you do have funds somewhere or they're forthcoming and there's hope for funds. So if you have an empty checkbook, don't despond, because just be grateful for that much.
Absolutely. And it has to do with that little illustration that I use often has to do with how it is our minds operate and whether in the face of lack or limit, our minds are able to see beyond that appearance or that temporary situation to the reality of what is really ours, and that is that we'll be guided and directed to the prosperity that we need. But we also have that situation in our physical bodies. When our physical bodies aren't the way that they ought to be, we need to see beyond the appearance to the reality of how we really are and how the real person of Mike Costello, Iris Freelander, or anyone else is. And that is always healthy and that is always strong. It may be that we're going through a time of physical ailment, but when we see beyond that and when we're able to claim the reality of who we are, take responsibility for where we are and how we got there without bemoaning that a lot. And I don't want to spend much time on that because I'm not much on analysis, as you know. I think we need to understand where we are, understand how we feel, understand what our illness is, and then move from that point.
That's correct. And when we think of mind, body, and spirit healing, we want to always remember the importance of exercise for our physical bodies. And we've talked a great deal about the spiritual aspect of being, and rightly so, and the mind. But it's important that we exercise our physical bodies.
It's important to exercise all aspects of our mind, our body, and our spirit, and to integrate those. But exercise, as we know, can be as simple as walking or deep breathing. It doesn't have to be strenuous, but it needs to be a regular regimen that we have.
Yes, and even jumping on a trampoline. I hear more and more about the importance of jumping on a trampoline for clearing the lymph glands, and it's the ductless lymph glands that take the poisons out of our body.
To keep that circulation going. Over this program, we've been talking to you about ideas and concepts about health and spirituality. We hope that you found this information useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time.